I just want to say what all my colleagues already say. A very warm thank you to Nikki. Very warm thank you to the Rice University, to all the team, to all the people in charge of everything, the sound, the slides, the water. We are so happy to be here. I'm just afraid, because we all need to apologize for something, just afraid that my paper will be less exciting, because I will only talk about, well, I won't talk about sex, and I will only talk about a manuscript and a typescript. So are there some secrets in the last Foucault's typescript? At the end of the film, The Decameron, Pasolini has the painter Giotto standing before his finally completed fresco, saying, "Why create a work when it is so beautiful to simply dream it?" Now that Michel Foucault's last great unpublished work, Confessions of the Flesh, has finally been published in France in 2018 and in the United States in 2021, we can no longer dream of this long-awaited, much hoped-for book, bringing an end to years of anticipation and speculation. The end of the dream partly explains the disappointment that accompanied its publication. Perhaps we expected more or too much from this book, as if it were supposed to deliver the philosopher's last word, or rather what should be a philosopher's final word, both the summary and the key to the entire oeuvre. But instead of the expected testament, readers encountered an in-depth discourse on early Christian perspectives on virginity and marriage. This disappointment, however, is not only related to the mythology of the last book. I believe it is also justified by a book that remains surprising in its structure, which does not allow us, on a first reading, to fully understand what Foucault wanted to convey through this last volume, a volume which closes his vast history of sexuality, began 8 years earlier. Such was the complexity and the nuanced layering of Foucault's analysis, that it left an impression of incompleteness, or at least of a narrative missing its conclusive insight, its editorial note. Hence, immediately among scholars and commentators in France and abroad, the emergence of doubts, inquiries regarding what was really published in 2018. These questions, these doubts, could be summarized in 4 very simple questions. These 4 questions share, I think, a common hope for something beyond Confession of the Flesh and its unfulfilled expectation. The 4 questions are as follows. Thank you very much. First question, is Confession of the Flesh a completed work? Second question, is Confession of the Flesh a finished work? I mean, there, a text can be perfectly written, close to be completed, without being finished, lacking that small yet symbolically significant element known as the end of the book. Third question, should Confession of the Flesh have had a sequel? You can see you have the answer. So if you want to have a coffee break, it's okay. Fourth and last question, is Confession of the Flesh a homogeneous work written in one go? This last question concerns the different periods of writing and the coherence of the final result. I will attempt to answer these questions based on the state of the manuscript and the typescript preserved now at the National Library of France. First, is Confession of the Flesh a completed work? The typescript of Confession of the Flesh was registered at Gallimard Publishing House with the mark October 1982. it has been partially corrected in two different ways. The first two chapters, the formation of a new experience and being virgin, were corrected by Foucault himself, using two different pencils, likely at two different times. The corrections are not very numerous, but they are regular and careful. They primarily involve three things. First, quite rarely, the body of the text, where Foucault simply adds nuance or streamlines the argument by removing passages. Second, the structuring of the text. Foucault, in some parts, adds some subsections. Third, the notes and bibliographic references. Some are missing at the bottom of the page, and Foucault completes them, sometimes adding Greek or Latin texts from his own archive. Indeed, everything suggests that he is not in a library, but at home. On several occasions, he identifies quotes from the church fathers in French that seem incorrect to him, but he merely notes in the merging that they will need to be verified. In the third chapter, the duty of spouses and the goods of marriage are not corrected. Unlike the preceding typescript is characterized, there is an abundance of missing words indicating they were typed by another person unfamiliar with Foucault's handwriting, whom I will refer to as typist number 2. In the last chapter, the libidinization of sex, someone else intervenes on the typescript to correct errors made by typist number 2. Identify not as Foucault, but as someone from the Gallimard publishing house. These details allow us to answer the first question. Foucault began correcting chapters 1 and 2 in a regular and careful manner. This correction demonstrates that, with very rare exceptions, the text can be considered definitive. While the manuscript shows numerous hesitations, erasures, and rewrites, Foucault does not intervene much on the typescript, except marginally on its form, only on its form. Structure, style, reference, nothing more. Second question, is Confession of the Flesh a finished work? In 2018, the text editor, who is among us, Frédéric Gros, my PhD tutor, highlighted this issue. The last pages of the typescript, rather than serving as a cohesive conclusion, diverge markedly from the established discourse, breaking the narrative, flow, and thematic continuity. To specify, Foucault has just announced the connection that has been tied in our culture between sex, truth, and law. The following page starts with, quote, "But the central problem is elsewhere," end of the quote, diverging abruptly from previous discussions without any prior mention of a problem. And Foucault moves on to something completely different, the sexual relationship in paradise, which was discussed much earlier, leading to the question of the link between sexual act and concupiscence. These pages are in complete disjunction with the preceding content. For this reason, the 2018 edition decided to refer these last pages to an appendix, appendix number 4. The manuscript preserved at the National Library confirms this decision. A curious detail marks the 9 sheets at the end of the manuscript, the impression of a paperclip. This subtle feature indicates that before their arrival at the library, someone, probably Foucault, who else, chose to group them separately. Of course, this is not a proof. It's just a sign of the unique status of these last pages. It's clear they were misplaced at the manuscript's end and thus typed there by mistake. This can be explained by the state of the manuscript handed over to Gallimard Publishing House. Even if the book was almost completed, Foucault delivered a rough, somewhat unclean document showing at that time, at this stage, little concern for finishing touches. He even leaves connections between parts missing or incorrect. For example, the end of the laborious baptism section remains in the form of scribbled notes, which typist number 1 cannot decipher. However, let's make a final remark on the end of the book. While the current ending proposed by the 2018 edition does indeed conclude the third part in a more coherent way, it does not conclude the entire book, which is an anomaly, especially if you compare to the volumes 2 and 3 of the History of Sexuality, the Use of Pleasure, and the Care of the Self. Each conclude with a general summary, even if it's very brief, 7 pages in both cases, placing the text within the broader series perspective. It is precisely, I think, this final sending off that we forever lack, and which would have allowed us to grasp the main teachings of Confessions of the Flesh and to better situate them within the whole project of the history of sexuality. Third question. Should Confessions of the Flesh have had a sequel? Numerous commentators have noted Foucault's perplexing announcement in the third chapter, an announcement that indeed appears on both the manuscript and the typescript. Augustine's conception of marriage, quote, having served as a constant reference for the sexual ethics of Western Christianity, will be the starting point of the next study, end of the quote. Was a sequel planned then? If so, all the disappointments and frustrations since 2018 suddenly make sense. However, before jumping to conclusions, this hypothesis encounters an undeniable fact. When volumes 2 and 3 of the History of Sexuality were published in 1984, it was officially announced that Confession of the Flesh would be the last volume. There will be no others. Is it conceivable to envision a sequel that falls outside of the history of sexuality? As for Batman, that would make no sense. What is announced as the next study, I mean the sexual ethics of Western Christianity, is precisely the theme itself of the history of sexuality. Why not include this next study within the series, rather than officially announcing the series is over? How can we explain this new mystery? First of all, we should not overlook the date Gallimard assigned to the typescript, October 1982. Let's ask ourselves, where was Foucault in his project in 1982? In May 1982, Confession of the Flesh was not the fourth, but only the third volume of the history of sexuality, as Foucault announced in the journal Communication. We can simply conclude that there was a planned sequel in 1982, and there wasn't one by 1984. Indeed, the sequel announced in 1982 is found in the part not yet revised by Foucault in 1984. In the meantime, the program changed. The Use of Pleasure was split into 2 volumes, as you know, with the addition of the Care of the Self. So the explanation might be very simple. As previously mentioned, Foucault delivered to Gallimard a raw document with several mismatches that are traces of older projects. The most evident of these mismatches is hidden under the first word of Confession of the Flesh as edited in 2018. The aphrodisia regime was formulated, it seems, by non-Christian philosophers and teachers. This first sentence is obviously an abrupt start, as noted by the 2018 edition. But the reality is even more disconcerting. The typescript indeed indicates this aphrodisia regime, crossed out by hand by Foucault, who replaces this with the. It is obvious. Beginning a book with this aphrodisia regime might seem to mock the reader, but suggesting, one supposes, that the first chapter was not initially the first, that there was something before on this aphrodisia. Confirmation in the table of contents available in the manuscript archive. Initially, probably around 1979, 1981, Création-Procréation, in red, was in fact not the first, but the second chapter of Confession of the Flesh, which was supposed to open with a presentation of Stoic morals at the birth of Christianity. Initially, the use of pleasure was nothing other than the first chapter of Confessions of the Flesh, under the name The Morals of the Elephant. Around 1982, Foucault decides to make the first chapter a book in its own right, The Use of Pleasure, and then two books with The Care of the Self. From this decision, the second chapter of Confession of the Flesh, this aphrodisia regime, thus becomes the first. Foucault moves it and puts it at the beginning of the manuscript, but he leaves a mismatch, which he corrects in 1984 on the typescript. We can therefore legitimately suppose that Foucault would have also corrected and even deleted the famous announced sequel to Augustinian marriage, a relic of an ancient project, of an older project. My answer to the last question will take the form of a conclusion. So, and maybe this is the more difficult one. Fourth question, is Confession of the Flesh a cohesive work written in one go? We have already answered this question with two examples. Although Confession of the Flesh emerges as a meticulously written, even crafted work, it's comprised of pieces, sometimes poorly connected, reflecting their origins in older projects. We already noticed that the first chapter of the final version, known under the title The Formation of a New Experience, belongs to an older version of the project, for which we have a table of contents. The argumentative, as we can see on the table of content, the number 5, the argumentative line of this older version was that of the techniques for manifesting the truth of oneself, exomologesis, exagoresis, in direct connection with the course on the government of the living, 1980. This iteration contained no discussions on virginity nor marriage. It is likely that it was supposed to continue with appendix number 2 in the 2018 edition, which is the logical continuation of the first chapter and announces the fate of these techniques in the second millennium. From this perspective, in 1980-1981, Confession of the Flesh remained a history of confession, significantly close to the initial project. But this logical and historical continuation from the acts of truth in the first millennium to confession in the second millennium was finally removed by Foucault and replaced by new material, being virgin, being married. These two developments come from the seminar at New York University in November 1980. During this seminar, Foucault modifies his program, not so much the techniques of manifesting the truth of oneself as the modes of self-experience through sexuality. That is, sexual ethics, independently of acts and discourse. Thus, the entire narrative of sexual history is internalized within the self-relationship, instead of being externalized in the confession to others. Even if Foucault still mentions the obligation to seek and tell the truth about oneself at the very end of Confession of the Flesh, it is no longer the core of his questioning. By abandoning the history of the confession of sexuality, Confession of the Flesh closes on virginity and marriage as problems, not of discourse, but of desire. That is, of self-intimacy. The key words of the argument are no longer truth discourse, but subject desire, which turn us towards privacy and consciousness. This brings us to Foucault's private and transformative decision, which explains the final and disturbing form of Confession of the Flesh. Somewhere around 1982, Foucault decided to abandon the vast genealogy of the act of confession from the first to the second millennium to replace it with the analysis of a moral experience of the self from the 2nd to the 5th century, and to conclude his history of sexuality with this gesture. Was it a way to rid himself of a project that had been too long and too often revised? Was he tired of confessions and even tired of the flesh? Or did he wish to bring Confessions of the Flesh as close as possible to the sapiential form of the use of pleasure and the care of the self, in order to form a triptych of ancient ethics? I think the lack of any real conclusion of the whole book, any sending off, does not allow us to answer these questions with certainty. I have a personal opinion about it, but personal opinion is not science. But now that we know that the TypeScript holds no hidden secrets, that there's nothing beyond it, we can appreciate the book for what it truly is, not the key to the entire oeuvre, but a splendid commentary on ancient texts, which allow Foucault to explore the ethical dimensions of human existence. Maybe this is what volumes 2 to 4 of the History of Sexuality are all about. Exploring human capacities for invention through very old, forgotten models of existence, at least in some parts of existence and in some part of society, before their resumption in the form of the law and in the form of the codes. In a certain way, history of sexuality turns to be Kant's anthropology in antiquity, focusing on what the human being, to quote Kant, as a free-acting being makes of himself or can and should make of himself. End of quotation. A pragmatic exploration of our freedom. Thank you very much.